The real reason he was suppressed is if you have that, you cannot sell the people the energy, you have to sell them only the antenna. And may I say, that's a very special kind of freedom. Economic freedom for the masses is a very special kind of freedom. You know, it's only with the rise of the Industrial Revolution that we average citizens have been or become relatively free economically. And so this would essentially free everyone.
He was the star of the age. He was on the front page of the New York Times, on the New York Sun, the New York Herald, Review of Reviews, Collier's, the Century Magazine, Public Opinion. All of the magazines of the day featured Tesla. This is another thing that intrigued me about him, was he was a tremendous star, world recognition, extremely famous, and that his close friends were people like the architect Stanford White and Mark Twain, and J. Pierpont Morgan and Tom Edison. We know all these other people, but the general public does not know Tesla, even though he was closely associated with all these people, and he was a star among these stars.
As his financial backers, Tesla had some of the most powerful men on the planet behind him. J.P. Morgan, to name one, John Jacob Astor, John Hayes Hammond Sr., and people of that ilk. And they were very happy with him when he was able to produce alternating current generators, alternating current motors, run a lot of copper lines over thousands of miles of territory, all of which was good for the mining industry and manufacturing and so on. And the great utilities were set up at this time. And the men I mentioned had heavy stock interest in all these things. And they patted Tesla on the back and said, go, go, boy, you know, make more of that alternating current juice. I mean, we're making a bundle on it.
Why was he left out? Encyclopedia Britannica had exactly one paragraph on this man. And he practically invented the 20th century as far as electrical appliances are concerned, electric material to motors, single-handedly.
He said in this letter that you people will make mistakes, but history will prove that I'm correct. I've got 1,000 patents in my name. There are more patents named after me than Archimedes and Galileo.
It's extremely exciting in the 100th year since Nikola Tesla came to America to rediscover, I think we have now just rediscovered, after 80 years, after 8 decades, we have rediscovered the more fundamental electromagnetics that Nikola Tesla was the first one to discover. He was, in fact, one of the greatest pioneers, scientific pioneers the world has ever seen.
This program could be called the Tesla, Galileo, Newton, Da Vinci, Tchaikovsky, Copernicus factor. For brevity, it is called the Zenith factor. This Zenith factor has been occurring regularly throughout the history of the planet in the persons of greatness, those few individuals who are misunderstood by society, ahead of their time, threatening because of their future views, and often causing jealousy in the ranks of their peers. These great movers of the planet are not acclaimed for their achievements until 100, sometimes 200 years after their death. In their time, they were exiled, excommunicated from the church, stoned in the town square, discredited, ridiculed, and silenced. Why it takes a century or two for society to rediscover these lost treasures and to include them in our text and history books, we may not be able to properly address. But what we can do is present to you the latest example of the Zenith factor. Also forgotten in our time, within this century, the great inventor Nikola Tesla. It has been 100 years since his arrival in New York City at the age of 28. Among his meager possessions was the prophetic letter from Charles Batchelor, addressed to Thomas Edison, which read, "I know two great men, and you are one of them. The other is this young man."
He gave the world the alternating current polyphase system. He gave the world fluorescent and neon lights, the radio, robotics, artificial intelligence, the laser beam, helicopters, and dematerialization devices.
At the turn of the century, after the successful development of the AC power system, giving that to the world, making motors and generators possible with his invention of the rotating field, after filing 40 fundamental patents in 5 years on absolutely unheralded, unparalleled action in the U.S. Patent Office, Tesla, of course, was at the height of electrical progress in the entire world. Tesla was firing 100-foot lightning bolts far before anybody else was even thinking of that. He was handling 50 and 100 million volts as if it was child's toys.
He was going to the United States in 1884 in order to work for Edison himself, the Wizard of Menlo Park, and give this great electrical genius his alternating current device. So when he was working for Edison, he tried to tell Edison that I've got this tremendous device, and Edison said, I'm not interested in alternating current, and don't ever bring it up again, because Edison was battling Westinghouse at the time, who was using alternating current. So Edison made a bad mistake. But later, when Tesla sold his patents to Westinghouse in 1888, Edison was successful in getting the Tesla alternating current machine used for the electric chair. And William Kemmler, who was an axe murderer, he had axed his mistress to death. He was the first man to die in the electric chair, and he died with a Tesla alternating current polyphase electrical motor. And I think Tesla was upset that Edison was able to pull this off. But so Tesla was annoyed at Edison in the early 1890s because of the war of the currents. But 10 years later, Edison backed Marconi. He was a consultant for the Marconi company. Marconi was definitely stealing the Tesla patents. He needed the high-frequency equipment in order to send these impulses. And I think that was really the straw that broke the camel's back, because Tesla felt that in the end, Edison had really betrayed him because he had gone to the other side and gone to that parasite Marconi. And so in Tesla's eyes, he was very upset with Edison. So 10 or 15 years later, when the Nobel Committee offers to have him share the prize with Tesla and Edison, Tesla freaked out. He didn't want to share the prize with this man who had stabbed him in the back, not once, but twice.
If Edison had a needle to find in a haystack, he would proceed at once with the diligence of a bee to examine straw after straw until he found the object of his search. I was a sorry witness of such doings, knowing that a little theory and calculation would have saved him 90% of his labor.
His closest friend was Robert Underwood Johnson and his wife Catherine. Johnson was editor of the Century magazine, and this magazine is like Life or Look today, Life magazine. It was the major magazine, and Johnson was the editor. Johnson, to some extent, I think, made Tesla a star by featuring him in the magazine with his pictures and pictures of the laboratory. And Johnson also knew all the intellectual elite of the day.
Even at the peak of his success, when I say the peak of his success, I would say around 1890 to 1900, when Tesla was a world figure. He was a lion and revered in every capital of the world. He gave papers before the Royal Society in London and the French Academy in Paris. Even at the height of his career, during that period, very few people in the world understood what Tesla was saying, what he was doing. His ideas were so revolutionary.
People did not understand him as a person, a personality, nor did they understand his visionary quality. He would see these devices in 3D and color, generators and so forth, and then tell his people in his laboratory how to build these devices. He did not draw plans like normal engineers do. And also the type of personality he was. He was, a very unusual, very mentally well-organized, brilliant person. And he had a good sense of humor. He interacted with Mark Twain and so forth, but I don't think he was understood by the community of people he was dealing with. And if you realize in those times, I mean, the amount of technology that's developed since then, you have to realize that was the frontier of a technological era, technological development. So I don't think he was understood personally, and I also don't think his work was understood. He didn't necessarily communicate all aspects of it, but he had tremendous vision of what he had planned to do, much more than he was able to accomplish. Also, we have people today that don't understand that either.
He had a photographic memory. He was almost flunked in the equivalent of what was called gymnasium in his native country because he had memorized all the logarithmic tables and could do them by memory from just looking at them. Now this happened to him, if my memory serves me correctly, as a result of a high fever and then a low-grade fever over a period of about 6 months, some illness that he had at age 9. After that, the man had trouble separating reality from his visual imagery, so that he would be walking, for example, down the street and would see these images of things, devices, to the point where he may walk into a post, so that the reality in his own mind was sometimes overbearing.
This was a very strange disease that he had. The impulses from the sun, he could not stand the sunlight, direct sunlight onto his body. He couldn't stand the sound of the carriages, the horse-moving carriages down the block. The shaking of it would affect him. He could hear a fly landing on a tabletop in the next room. The clock ticking echoed in his head very loudly. And he had to lie in a bed on pads. And he really thought that he was going to die. And at the same time, I think he had what's known as an opening up of the third eye. He was able to detect objects with his forehead. And this was the attainment of cosmic consciousness, and was right after this illness that he had the vision, speaking about Goethe's Faust, of the view of alternating current, where he saw at once how he could create this rotating magnetic field.
When I get an idea, I start at once building it up in my imagination. I change the construction, make improvements, and operate the device in my mind. It is absolutely immaterial to me whether I run the turbine in thought or test it in my shop. There's no difference whatever. The results are the same.
I went to colleagues, Nobel Prize winning physicists and so forth, and I asked them, what did you think of Tesla's work? And a lot of them had some idea. They'd heard of Tesla coils, and in fact it was interesting. I lived on Tesla Avenue for a while. Anyway, what I found was they never talked about their work. They always went to the point that he was nuts and fed pigeons in his old age. That is invariably the comment I got. They had never read even one of his patents.
He was a bit arrogant. He was a prima donna. He had given the world alternating current. Almost overnight, the world changed. Before his invention, energy could only be transmitted about a mile. After his invention of AC, energy could be transmitted hundreds of miles. And in 1895, just a few years later, it was put into Niagara Falls. And at that point, the entire world changed, because the world could see that this one invention was transmitting energy hundreds of miles. It was the proof. So he became, almost overnight, they said, a new Edison on the horizon. He became the world's greatest inventor. And throughout the entire 1890s and the early 1900s, he was known as the world's greatest inventor, or he and Edison as the two world's greatest inventors. And so he lived very, very high and in luxury, moving into the Waldorf Astoria. And he dined with the 400. He knew people like Henry Clay Frick. He knew John Jacob Astor, who backed him, who also allowed him to live in the Waldorf. Astor gave him $30,000 to build his laboratory in Colorado. So he knew all of the intellectual elite of the day, and he invited these people all back to his laboratory where he could do these fantastic experiments. He'd send 1,000,000 volts through his body. He'd send 1,000,000 volts through Twain's body, and Twain would light up a light bulb, and then Johnson would print it in the Century magazine. And, you know, living at the time before really we had cars, before people really had electric lights, looking at these electric events that Tesla was creating was very dramatic, and I think he became a focal point for the 400, that they wanted very much to be a part, to know him, to touch him.
We know that he had anticipated the whole broadcast industry, and he finally had to reveal to Morgan and his financiers that what he really was doing with the great tower he was erecting shortly after 1900 on Long Island in New York. He was going to give the entire world free energy. All you would have to do once he had the Earth in resonance would be put up an antenna at the proper frequency, and you could extract energy directly, very cheaply.
Bernard Baruch was a famous economist and financial advisor to J.P. Morgan, is alleged. Now, I always got this secondhand that you won't find it anywhere in print, but Jack O'Neill gave me this information, who's the official biographer of Nikola Tesla, and he said that Bernard Baruch told J.P. Morgan, he said, look, this guy is going crazy. What he's doing is he wants to give free electrical power to everybody, and we can't put meters on that. We're just going to go broke supporting this guy. And suddenly, overnight, Tesla's support was cut off. The work was never finished. And not only that, and this is all speculation what I'm saying from now on, there were only about 5 major electrical engineering schools in the country at that time. We're talking about the early 20th century. The word just got around, don't teach Tesla, so you never found him in the textbooks. Forget about this guy, he doesn't exist. All of his writings kind of slowly disappeared, and I understand that process because same thing happened to me, without going into all the details. And suddenly, Tesla became a non-person.
I think Tesla dropped into obscurity for a number of reasons. I think the first major reason was there were ego battles between people like Steinmetz and Elihu Thomson and William Stanley, who worked for Westinghouse, people that tried to take credit for his invention. He conceived of the rotating magnetic field, but once it was thought up, it was a very easy thing to duplicate. And because of that, I think that people would say, well, anybody could have thought of that, rather than really accepting the true genius that he was to conceive of this entire power system. So I think the first reason was jealousy among his peers. They didn't write about him in their textbooks when they wrote about his polyphase system. The second reason is his belief in extraterrestrial existence. And I think that he kept coming back to the possibility of interplanetary communication. The reason why I think he did was because he had cosmic consciousness. He knew that there must be intelligent beings outside of our little tiny Earth. And if he was going to electrify the globe, the next step was to communicate with other worlds. But because of that, he lost credibility among his peers. So that was the second major reason. And the third major reason was his falling out with J. Pierpont Morgan. He had formed a partnership with Morgan in 1901 to build this huge tower out on Long Island. The tower was actually constructed, it was 187 feet to the top, which he called a magnifying transmitter. Morgan had given him $150,000 to construct this tower. And Tesla began to build it. At the same time, Morgan was involved in stock manipulations with the Northern Pacific Railroad, and because of that, the stock of the Northern Pacific went up to $1,000 a share in one day in May of 1901, and all the other stocks dropped. And when they dropped, there was panic on Wall Street, front page of the New York Times. And because of that, Tesla's costs then skyrocketed. People demanded money, and he needed to ask Morgan for more money. Morgan was in difficult straits because of the economic conditions that he had created himself, and Tesla made the mistake of saying to Morgan, look, you've created a panic on Wall Street, and because of your panic, I'm having difficulty making my payments. And Morgan would not. He was the richest, most powerful man in the world. He didn't want to be talked to that way. Tesla, who was a bit of an egotist, he was the world's greatest inventor, and he was talking, at this level to Morgan. So Morgan took away funds. The other reason why Morgan took away funds was because Tesla decided that instead of merely sending messages to Europe, which is what this giant transmitting station was meant to do, he also wanted to transmit power. Their initial contract was not to transmit power, it was only to transmit messages. And when Tesla changed the nature of the contract, in a sense, he breached the contract. And Morgan was upset because had Tesla succeeded in his plans, Morgan would have had to completely change General Electric. Westinghouse would have had to completely change Westinghouse. And so there were great corporate forces which were going to prevent him from finalizing his wireless transmission station. The transmission station, though, in its total conceptualization, is way beyond something that we have today. He saw global communications in 1901. He was going to construct a radio city. He was going to transmit pictures around the world. He was even going to light up shipping lanes in the Atlantic Ocean by igniting the clouds with this huge magnifying transmitter. He was setting the Earth in resonance. So the three major reasons were jealousy among his peers, the interplanetary communication hypothesis that he stayed with, and the fact that he lost out with Morgan.
And so discredited, silenced, and with the world's greatest secrets still in his mind, longing to complete his grand design, Tesla ended his days in lonely obscurity. He died at the age of 86 in his shabby New York hotel room in 1943. His achievements should have secured a high place in history and in the minds and hearts of a grateful society, but it was not to be. As his moment arrived, is Nikola Tesla the zenith factor? The implications of his advanced thinking and inventions lead us to electromagnetics and quantum theory.
I found very sharp digressions between Tesla's statements and the present view of electromagnetics. For example, in the present view of electromagnetics, the vibrations in the air or in the vacuum supposedly are like string vibrations. They're transverse. Tesla said in no uncertain terms that this was not true. The vibrations were like sound waves. They were compressions and rarefactions. In other words, they were longitudinal. So now either they are one or the other, and we of course directly measure the kind of waves that we think are there. We measure transverse waves. Well, in chasing the foundations and looking at what we actually measure, we measure the electron gas in the antenna. We do not measure the vacuum at all. And when they formed the theory, they didn't know about electrons. The theory was formed some 100 years ago, essentially by pre-runners of Maxwell and then by Maxwell and others. And all they knew about was a thin material ether, like a thin fluid. And so it meant that if you measured thin fluid vibrations that were transverse, obviously the vacuum had to be shaking transversely. Today we know that is not true. And what we know is that we have electron gases, free electrons in the wire that we stick up for an antenna. Those electrons are more or less like little balls and spinning. They're like little gyros, and they don't move down the wire, they move transversely because of precession. It means that Nikola Tesla was right after all, and the disturbance in the ether is and always has been longitudinal. It has to be at right angles to that. So if that is correct, of course, if that stands up, it means that every textbook in the United States of America is wrong.
The sharp point of difference, it was purely technical, there was nothing personal about it, was that all the fundamental equations of Einstein said that light has a limiting velocity. Nothing could exceed the speed of light, 186,000 miles a second. Tesla, on the other hand, I just might point out that Einstein was a theoretician. He wouldn't know which end of a screwdriver was the useful end to use. I mean, a typical theoretician in that way. Whereas Tesla, on the other hand, was an absolute laboratory man. His hands were made to create something, and he was always doing things, building equipment, experiments, etc., etc. So obviously, how could a man of great integrity like Tesla agree with Einstein when his own data showed that the speed of light can be exceeded?
Mathematics is good, but there is no magic in mathematics. The concepts that are being manipulated by the mathematics, the answers are no better or no worse than those concepts that are at the foundation of it. The mathematics alone has no content. So we have become overly mathematized, and we simply do not allow people to think any longer about basics. What is mass? What is inertia? What is time? Things like that. They tell you today, don't ask those questions. There is no acceptable definition of mass in physics. There is no acceptable definition of time. In quantum mechanics, time is not even observable, can't even be detected even in theory.
He was looking at the structure of space-time, the structure of matter, in a completely different way than Einstein was. And I think that this is an important aspect of Tesla, and that is that his whole conception of how the structure of matter is built is in an entirely different dimension than classical physics says today. The fact that he disagreed with Einstein made him seem like a crackpot, but now there's a great deal of interest in studying the longitudinal waves, studying free energy, I think that Tesla was looking at resonant frequencies, action at a distance, and probably tachyonic realms, faster than light speed realms.
In the old days, a scientist was really poor. He was just a little bit a notch above poverty level. For example, if he got a grant, it would be a grant from one of the rich industrialists, say a Morgan or an Edison. And the grant might be in the amount of $5,000, or, a great grant would be $10,000. So we're not talking about people who had enormous sums of money to spend on vast projects. And so they tended to work very intensely and very closely in small knit groups and very intensely on a subject. With the expansion of research, we have had a great rise, number one, in the number of scientists. In the old days, there wasn't very many anyway. Almost an explosion in the number of scientists. We've had almost an explosion in the level of funding, government funding of research. And with government funding all these years, there has come government bureaucracy. The government scientists and the government funding, and they force the creation in the civilian life of parallel kinds of structures to communicate with them and to accept the money and farm the money out. And so what we've had is a great, in my view, a great bureaucratization of science itself. A great scientific bureaucracy has arisen. And as you know, in the human business, any bureaucracy is it's a camel designed by a committee. So I think what's happened is the things that's important to the scientific establishment get well funded, and they get very good people working on them, and they do by and large very good work. No question about that. The things that have, number one, they're controversial, or number two, that are heretical. They represent heresy against the established prevailing interpretation. They just don't get any funding at all, and the scientists who persist in that find themselves being ostracized by their peer groups. And pretty soon they don't have positions of influence, if they have positions at all, and maybe not even have jobs. Now that's nothing that new. This scientific attitude, for example, has been there for a very long time indeed. One of the great mathematicians, I believe it was Gauss, had worked out nonlinear geometry but did not dare publish it for 30 years because he knew immediately it would destroy him and call it heresy. Lobachevsky came along, of course, published nonlinear geometry, and it destroyed him. The man who came up with the original idea, most of the original idea for conservation of energy, Meyer, was hounded out of his position, driven insane. And science itself has a history of such persecutions of the scientist who is highly unorthodox, highly controversial, and heretical.
The United States government will not allow anybody to openly speak about this stuff. We have to kind of sneak out our information through a publication in Canada called the Planetary Association for Clean Energy newsletter, or in short, PACE newsletter. So we have I have no access to network television, as an example. I can't say the things I'm saying to this camera.
We don't say in science that we have a law of God, but we say a law of nature, and it means the same thing: thou shalt never change it. As a matter of fact, nature does not have any laws. Those laws are man-made models, and they apply to very broad, very general situations only when certain conditions prevail. Now, we try to make that as general as possible, but you can violate any law of nature. Nature has been very kind. Particularly if you can bend and warp space-time, all laws can be changed. So, but what happens is one part of the scientific establishment digs in and becomes very orthodox and very staid. We would call them fundamentalists if we were speaking of a religion, and it becomes very analogous to a religion. And thereafter, thou must never do anything to challenge one of the great laws, and one of the great masters who has spoken that law. And so we find a dogma which builds up in science. Now, that's not entirely bad. Not every wild scheme that comes down the pipe is even worthy of attention. But, for example, when we put together fundamentals of a theory over 100 years ago, and we have never gone back after 100 years and reworked the foundations, it's high time we did so. Interestingly, the original paper that Einstein published, which dealt with what we today call relativity, had really no new formulas. The Lorentz transforms had already been worked out by Lorentz, not Einstein. It was just algebra. It had no high-powered mathematics in it. It was very simple ideas. You could not today get such a paper published in a scientific journal in the United States of America.
In 1945, the United States dropped a nuclear bomb on Japan and shocked the living dickens out of the world of science. All of a sudden, we had this cloak of secrecy slapped on not only the scientists who developed the bomb, but anybody who worked in the world of nuclear physics. And the ivory tower level became so high, the funding level was so high for all of this that the physics professors, the engineer support troops, as I call them, who went to work on these projects became little tin gods, and they've completely forgotten that they're looking for truth.
Obviously, there's a great deal of investment in the power system grid that we have. Unfortunately, some of the frequencies utilized in this system are not very biologically beneficial. It turns out, since it seems like Tesla's device resonates normal oscillations of the Earth themselves, it turns out we've done some work in looking at that effect on human beings. And it seems to be a positive effect. I mean, that is one issue that's very important to consider. And I guess my idea, or plea, if you want to call it, is to have people look at different solutions. And I think there are very possible solutions. I think it's very important to start looking at the positive and negative benefits and detriments of what we have now and how we can improve that system, because there are biological problems that are detrimental.
Excuse me for interrupting. First of all, I'll make a quick statement about non-ionizing radiation, which is what we're discussing, basically, except for the plasma containment if this transmitter-receiver type device that Tesla envisioned happened. The non-ionizing effects are, in fact, replicatable as experimental data, but nobody wants to look at this because, quote, unquote, it's bad for business. The same thing is said of ionizing radiation. I think it was Ed Teller, and Elizabeth can directly quote him. I think he said this to you in person, that ionizing radiation is good for a person. It's good for you. He has to take that position.
Some of the equipment, it would just have to be tuned slightly differently. It would be the same equipment, and it would be beneficial, and people wouldn't have irritability and other, maybe perhaps other diseases related to being under high power tension lines.
Heart arrhythmias
and heart attacks and so forth.
Erythemias, reddening of the skin.
And this is true of many of these things. The problems are solvable. The whole issue in Canada now is a video display terminal problem, and the pulse magnetic fields coming out of computer systems, and the skin reddening from the electrostatic field coming off of the front of the cathode ray tubes.
Elizabeth and I have done work
but
in
there's some
all
fairly,
of these fields.
First of all, we want to find out if there's a problem, what is the nature of that problem, and I think the solutions are not that difficult. In fact, it may even be beneficial to the industry. They just sell a device that they put on it that may not cost very much and keep the thing in place. The operators will feel better, they'll feel healthier, they're not going home irritable, they're not having problems driving. I mean, it would be interesting because as these things happen, it comes on slowly and people do not see the changes that's occurring within their own self and within their families, within the community structures. And it's interesting because most of us don't get away from these devices and we don't see what's happening.
July 4, 1976, the Russians gave us a bicentennial present, which was a huge radio signal that emanated from the area of central Russia, and which we now call the woodpecker or the Soviet ELF. ELF means not a little elf in a garden, but it means extremely low frequency radio waves. I realized that the Soviets had developed what I call a mind control weapon, and nobody could prove that they were doing it in a sense because nobody knew the technology. And so I was a good patriot, I thought, went to our government, all levels, from the president on down, the Canadian government from Prime Minister Trudeau on down, the British government, to tell them that this new Soviet weapon has got us at their mercy. And people looked at me, what are you talking about? Mind control from Soviet Union? I say there, old chap, you know. Anyway, nobody really believed it, and I realized that it would take a long time for our people to catch up with the Soviet technology. They were about 10, 20 years behind, best estimates at the time. So I bent all my efforts to finding a method of personal protection for every individual, so no matter what the Soviets did or any other country did with this type of signal broadcast, were all really invented by Tesla, but of course he never used it for this kind of purpose. And I, as a medical man, was concerned about babies and about plants and about porpoises and about all creatures on the earth. All of them are influenced by this signal. Now we found out much later, I mean it took years to develop all this work, so I'm jumping over a lot of time. It was eventually established, particularly by the U.S. Navy, that this ELF signal, which is so weak that you can hardly detect it unless you have super special detectors, it's so weak can actually induce mutagenic changes in DNA, which means that the DNA is abnormally stimulated to produce abnormal hormones, brain peptides, etc., all the way up to the mutagenic end effect in living cells, which is cancer. This is absolutely proven now, published in scientific journals. It's one of the greatest mysteries in science to use some numbers. The part of the radio wave that affects your DNA, I think everybody nowadays knows what DNA means. I don't have to define it, but it's the essential regulatory mechanism of all cells. And the essential active agent in that radio wave is the magnetic component. There are two components to all radio waves, the electrical vector and the magnetic vector. And it's been found that you can stimulate a brain, a cell in the brain, a DNA in the brain, at a level of 1 billionth of a Tesla. Tesla is the unit, international unit of magnetic measurement. If my brain, let's say, as I was a subject, was running at 9 hertz, and I pressed 5 hertz out there, my brain would switch from 9 hertz down to 5 hertz, and that's all you would see. And it would be driving my brain to, at that particular frequency. It's called entrainment, is the idea. In other words, the brain is now being driven by an external artificial stimulus. Well, we did a bunch of human beings like this and found out that at least half of them were sensitive to the effects of an ELF signal. And then we found out that very specific frequencies, at 6.66 hertz, for example, people would get very depressed in a matter of minutes. And then we found out at 8 hertz, they would feel very good. It was a great feeling, like being in high meditation. And at 10.80 to 11 hertz, we found out that they would get very agitated. And if you push the signal up to 13, people would go into riotous behavior.
Tesla was a naturalized citizen. He did become an American citizen, of which he was extremely proud. Tesla thought more of his citizenship papers by far than he did of his own patents. He put the patents in the file. He locked his citizenship papers in the safe. He was very proud and extremely proud to be an American. And but when he died, the FBI came in under the Alien Property Act as if he were an alien and not a naturalized citizen, and seized all the property. And that's illegal. It's really illegal to use that act to do that. It was an illegal act. It's illegal to this day.
It's a strange irony of history, but somehow 2 of the FBI men on that Buck Rogers break-in squad operation decided that since nobody was around, they would just pick a few of the papers that looked good to them for their own private use, whatever they had in mind. And eventually, the correspondence that I mentioned between Tesla and the 3 governments and some of his most secret weapons, the most powerful weapons, were never seen by the U.S. government. They got into the private hands of these 2 FBI men, and eventually I met one of them and I got hold of the papers, and then finally found out what the beam weapon was, and he was the inventor of what's called a particle beam weapon, which is just now, 40-some odd years later, being exploited by the United States Defense Department.
I mentioned the bomb Aronoff effect, and to put it very simply, you can put energy in here and you can take it out at a distant point, produce it at that distant point, without any travel in between. What goes in between are potentials, not energy. It turns into energy again. You translate energy into another form here. You translate that back into energy at the distant target area. Now, if you take your potentials here and you make them negative, in other words, lower than the distant point, you will remove energy from the distant intersection point of the two beams we're talking about, and that energy will now re-emerge here at this point. You'll have to dump it into water or something for cooling. If you do that in a pulse fashion with a large amount of potentials, you will produce in that distant point a sudden drastic cold, a cold explosion, an endothermic reaction rather than an exothermic reaction. And there's 77 things that I mentioned in the Soviet Arctic since 1974 picked up by our weather satellites are examples. We flew an airplane through one of them to see what it was made of. It was made of ice, little dust and dirt, you know, from the stuff in the air. Water vapor suddenly frozen into ice particles, very much colder than the surrounding air. If you're in an area where such a cold explosion occurs, it occurs throughout the space-time in the area. So you could have on all the insulation in the world and be sitting on a heater. It wouldn't make any difference at all. It would suck the heat right out of your very vitals. You'd freeze to a solid block of ice in seconds. And that zone might be 50, even 150 miles across. So it becomes a weapon of great magnitude, but in the nuclear business, it is a clean weapon. That is, you don't have any nuclear fallout, you don't have any contamination of the soil, but you save the farmland and you don't have deadly poisoning chemically or nuclear of the area.
These are but a fraction, in the event confusion or fear has arisen, of the known implications of Nikola Tesla's electromagnetic world. Yet there was a death ray which could implode individuals or troops, as well as disable electromagnetic defense equipment. A pocket-sized oscillator capable of taking down vibratorily the Empire State Building in less than half an hour. An ozone generator for personal health and for purifying industrial waste. Tesla claimed ozone cured cancer. The current thinking says ozone causes cancer. Incidentally, documentation shows that Tesla twice refused Soviet invitations to speak and to demonstrate his inventions. Then there was also the matter of the contract he held from George Westinghouse for royalties on his alternating current, at the rate of $1 per horsepower generated, which Tesla tore up in order to stave off financial difficulties of Westinghouse Company and to ensure the national use of AC. It has been estimated that at the time of his death, Tesla would have accrued $12 million in royalties.
George Westinghouse was, in my opinion, the only man on the globe who could take my alternating current system under the circumstances then existing and win the battle against prejudice and money power. He was a pioneer of imposing stature and one of the world's noblemen.
He wrote a paper called Increasing Human Energy, which was to increase the effectiveness of human beings, and he felt that this would be key and instrumental in allowing people to come together, communicate, and not feel isolated, not be at war with each other as individual countries, but see their existence on the planet as a whole. And although we saw later when the astronauts went into space and they looked back and they saw the idea that Buckminster Fuller said, spaceship Earth, I think he had a vision like that in his mind because he really felt that way about it, as seeing the Earth as a whole and the populace as a whole on Earth. And I think emotionally we really probably didn't see that as well as when we looked back from the moon and saw the Earth rise. So I think he had the ability to see that.
He probably was the first person who invented a satellite communication system with no satellites.
He was all or nothing, and he wanted to be completely into creating the new world. He was a major architect for the new world, and he saw himself as that and undertook that responsibility. And rather than have a relationship with one single individual, he decided to have a relationship with humanity.
We will see demonstrated two honest-to-goodness, real, free energy devices. one built by John Bedini, one built by Dr. Jim Watson. Both John and Jim have been very kind and pointed out that, you know, looking at ideas like this is what got them started in building that type of a motor. And the point is, does the motor work or does it not? The motor will work under rigorous testing, and that's the final test of the whole thing.
These are self-adjusting generators. They're not doing anything to the environment. They're not putting out any harmful fields. They're actually taking in this energy that is rained upon us every day. That's exactly how this generator operates. And they're putting back in the battery and also powering lights at the same time. Since this world right now is running out of fuel, you know, it pays to investigate these things, pays to see what these zero-gravity field generators are doing. I mean, they have them in Europe, they have them here in the U.S., they've been popping up all over. I'm sure that the scientific community, you know, once they start to realize that people are building these machines and putting them in motion. I mean, you saw a big machine sitting up there this morning with a 102-pound flywheel. That's got some power, you know. Built absolutely correctly, it could have powered this whole hall that we're standing right in front of, and then had some to spare for the next hall. But the point was that this is how it starts off. It starts out like the old steam engine. You know, this is a technology that we missed.
Once you become hooked on Tesla, he doesn't let you go. I think the Tesla story is a huge story. His own life is very, very important in understanding his life, but also society's reaction to his life I find probably more intriguing on a certain level, because I think that it is an astounding phenomenon that so important an inventor could have slipped into obscurity.
The world needs a highly efficient energy system. The world at this point also needs something to take its attention off mass destruction.
We now have this IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers meeting here in Colorado Springs, in which we've got, I don't know, some 300 or 400 people out there in the audience, and all of them are in the engineering fields or in one way or another fascinated by the legend of this heroic figure that is suddenly a nobody.
He gave us what one scientist said was the warp and woof of industry. Tesla always kept in mind historical perspective. He was creating these inventions for humanity, and they're all patented, they're all out there. And even though he failed in his ultimate ability to try and transmit electrical power by means of wireless transmission, he also knew, and he said this in his autobiography, that it was the reason why he failed was because of natural law, but the same natural law will cause a resurgence and his inventions will come to the surface again.
Tesla's importance today speaks directly of the interdependence of all things implicit in nature's laws, often referred to as holism. If we can perceive that our world is in trouble, out of balance, perilously close to planetary disaster, then surely the solution lies within holism. Likewise, within the research and application of the legacy of Nikola Tesla. If, on the other hand, we explore Tesla only for military purposes and not for his holistic intent, we are doomed to remain out of balance. We close our program with excerpts taken from the more than 50 unsuccessful letters Tesla wrote to J.P. Morgan between 1901 and 1906.
Dear Mr. Morgan, I have perfected the greatest invention of all time, the transmission of electrical energy without wires to any distance, a work which has consumed 10 years of my life. It is the long-sought stone of the philosophers. I need but to complete the plant I have constructed, and in one bound, humanity will advance centuries. I am the only man on this earth today who has this peculiar knowledge and ability to achieve this wonder, and another one may not come in 100 years. It is incredible. A year and a half ago, I could have delivered a lecture here, which would have been listened to by all the academia of the world. Now you let me struggle on, weakened by shrewd enemies, disheartened by doubting friends, financially exhausted, trying to overcome obstacles which you yourself have piled before me. You engage in impossible operations. You make me pay double. Yes, make me wait 10 months for machinery. On top of that, you produce a panic. Morgan is the last man to let a good thing go by, they say. Not a cent. It is spread all over town. I am discredited, the laughing stock of my enemies. You are a big man, but your work is wrought in passing form. Mine is immortal. I came to you with the greatest invention of all times. I have more original creations named after me than any other man that has gone before me, not excepting Archimedes and Galileo. $6,000 million are invested in enterprises based upon my discoveries in the United States today. Since a year, Mr. Morgan, there's been hardly a night when my pillow is not bathed in tears. Will you not listen to anything at all? Are you to let me perhaps succumb, lose an immortal crown?